welcome back. Today we're looking at Chapter 16, Section 3, The Crisis Deepens. In the previous lessons, we talked about the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850 and attempts that were being made to compromise over this issue of slavery and keep the country from really tearing itself apart through civil war. But as we know, that wasn't the case, that the country eventually did tear itself apart, but we're not quite there yet, so we're still talking about the issues leading up to the Civil War, and today we're going to be talking about two very important ones, and those would be the impacts of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Dred Scott decision. Now, in the Kansas-Nebraska Act was again over this issue of slavery in the territories, and it brought into question the Missouri Compromise, as well as the Dred Scott case, which was tried before the Supreme Court. And we're going to end the day talking about that decision, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So, as you can see, there's also audio recordings of today's lesson, but if you want to keep with the video, let us move on to our key terms. And our key terms for today are the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which led to border ruffians, guerrilla, as in like guerrilla warfare, lawsuit, which is a review of what a lawsuit is, and in that we will be talking about Dred Scott versus Sanford, or the Dred Scott case, which I alluded to just a moment ago. Now, if you've watched any of these videos or looked at any of my lessons before, you know that I really like to start things off with a question, something that really thought-provoking. But for today's question, it's one of the most basic questions that I could ask, and it is, did you know? Now, did you know that a Supreme Court decision and an act of Congress actually ended up moving the United States closer to civil war in the 1850s? Do you know any ways that the Supreme Court has affected your daily life? What about acts of Congress? Isn't it the job of government to protect the people? The government is for the people and by the people. So how could decisions that they make lead to division in the country? Today, I alluded to it just a few moments ago, but we're going to be talking about some decisions made by men in Washington, D.C. that outraged many, many people, but were seen as great decisions by others. It all depended on your point of view and which side you were on. Some people saw these decisions as fantastic ideas, others saw them as just abysmal, horrible. Politics can be very, very divisive, but sometimes tough decisions have to be made that are unpopular. So as we go through today's lesson, think about what your reaction would have been to these decisions if you were living at this time. So in the previous lesson, we talked about the Compromise of 1850, and the goal of the Compromise of 1850 was to end the debate over slavery forever. Hopefully it would settle the issue of slavery, especially in the Western territories as they applied to become states. But as we know, that really was not the case. The Compromise of 1850 really only dealt with slavery here in the lands of the Mexican Cession, but didn't really solve the problem with states being formed from the Louisiana Purchase. So Senator Stephen Douglas introduced a bill to Congress known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which would set up a government for that territory, but that the territory should be split into two different territories. So it took this one section here, the Kansas Territory, and split it into the territories of Kansas and Nebraska. And settlers in those areas, in the Kansas Territory and the Nebraska Territory, would then decide on slavery based on popular sovereignty. Remember us talking about popular sovereignty? So Now, the Southern Democrats didn't want another free state, and the Northerners didn't want another slave state. So Douglas wanted to organize the territory to try and attract settlers so that there would be a railroad that would go through there, and this act, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, would just completely do away with the Missouri Compromise line. And as a result, it caused a lot of controversy. So here's the Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act seemed to be fair because it took the idea of popular sovereignty and applied it to this region. Southern leaders liked it because there were the possibilities of new slave states. So even though the lands were north of that imaginary Missouri Compromise line, there was still the possibility that maybe the settlers moving into this area would want slaves. And they were sure that slave owners from Missouri would move into that region and to help Kansas become a slave state. Even the president at that time, Franklin Pierce, supported the act and helped to push it through Congress, not knowing what would happen after it was pushed through. Those who opposed the act, where do you think they were from? Correct, they were mainly from the North. Northerners stated that the act would overturn the Missouri Compromise and possibly allow for slavery in an area where previously slavery had been banned. And this act was seen as a, quote, criminal betrayal of precious rights, and opponents would openly challenge the Fugitive Slave Act as a form of protest. So, Compromise of 1850, that was all unorganized territory, but it was above the Missouri Compromise line, so slavery was banned in that territory. With the Kansas-Nebraska Act, now it was split into two different territories, and settlers would be allowed to vote based on popular sovereignty. Even President Pierce supported it, but Northerners hated this idea because now there was the possibility that this area where slavery had been banned could potentially become new slave states.
When President Franklin Pierce moved into the White House in 1853, only a few years had passed since the nation had acquired its lands along the Pacific Ocean. At that time, there was still no railroad line to the West Coast, but people knew that as soon as one could be built, a cross-country trip could be made in less than a week. As it stood, most passengers and trade goods from the Atlantic coast had to travel by ship around the tip of South America, so that a voyage of several months was required to reach the harbor of San Francisco from eastern ports. Back then, land surveyors believed that one of the most practical routes for a railroad to California would pass through the hot desert land south of the Gila River in today's state of Arizona. However, in early 1853, that land still belonged to Mexico. But later that year, Mexican President Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna sold America this region, called the Gadsden Purchase, for $10 million. And as a result of the Gadsden Purchase, over 29,000 square miles of land, or nearly 77,000 square kilometers, were added to the country. While new land was being acquired for a southern railroad route, Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas proposed the creation of a northern railroad route to the Pacific that would run west from the growing city of Chicago. Douglas knew that a northern railroad route would be of great financial benefit to his home state of Illinois, and a northern railroad route would run through the unorganized territory in the center of the country, bringing rapid settlement to that area as well. Back then, this region was home to several large Native American tribes and the huge herds of buffalo upon which they depended for food. To win the approval of voters from the southern slave states for a northern railroad route, the creation of two new territories, Kansas and Nebraska, was proposed. Douglas wanted them to be places where popular sovereignty would exist, meaning that if the settlers in these territories wanted slavery, they could have it. And so, with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, the Missouri Compromise, the law that had kept slavery out of the North for 34 years, was repealed. In response to its passage, a group of people in Wisconsin founded the Republican Party. Its main purpose was to support politicians like Abraham Lincoln, who sought to end slavery in America.
Senator Douglas hoped that settlers in Kansas would decide the issue peacefully on Election Day, but both pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces went to the area to fight, literally and figuratively, for control of the territory. Most of the settlers in Kansas were poor farmers who didn't even own slaves, but they were just looking for cheap land and looking for a way and a place to start over. So pro-slavery settlers moved into Kansas and wanted to make sure that anti-slavery forces didn't take control of that territory. And there were actually groups from Missouri who were later called Border Ruffians, who came across the border to fight with anti-slavery groups in Kansas. And by fight, I mean that in the literal sense, physical altercations over slavery in the Kansas territory. And as we can see here, this is a zoom in on the border between Missouri and Kansas. So you can see that they're right up next to each other. So these, quote, border ruffians came over into Kansas, and they didn't just fight, they actually voted illegally to help set up a pro-slavery government in Kansas in 1855. And this new pro-slavery legislature quickly passed laws protecting slavery and making helping slaves a crime punishable by death, and so on. So this was a pro-slavery government, and it was very, very pro-slavery. But because it had been set up by people who had come in from Missouri and voted illegally, anti-slavery groups refused to accept this new government and elected their own governor and legislature. So Kansas Territory now has two different governments. One was pro-slavery and one was anti-slavery. So bands of pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces began roaming around the territory, and in 1856 a pro-slavery group raided the town of Lawrence, Kansas, and destroyed homes and smashed a Free Soil newspaper. So in response, a man named John Brown, an abolitionist whose name is going to come up in the future as well, he had come to Kansas to help it become a free state, and decided that with these attacks going on, that he was going to take matters into his own hands and retaliate after that attack in Lawrence. Brown, his 4 sons, and 2 other men went to Powhatami Creek and killed 5 pro-slavery settlers in the middle of the night. And this back and forth guerrilla warfare on both sides resulted in over 200 people dead by the end of 1856. So between 1855 and 1856, pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces had killed 200 people, causing newspapers to refer to Kansas as Bleeding Kansas. But this violence was not just limited to Kansas. Oh no. Remember how I mentioned earlier in a previous lesson that Congress itself at this time was getting so things were getting so tense in Congress that congressmen started bringing weapons with them to Congress. Congressmen had been attacking each other verbally over the issue of slavery for years, but at this time it got so bad that after a speech by Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, in which he denounced the pro-slavery legislature in Kansas and Andrew Butler of South Carolina specifically, that Butler's nephew, who's also a congressman, Preston Brooks, came to Sumner's chamber and beat him with a cane. Southerners believed that Charles Sumner got what he deserved, but such an attack in the halls of Congress, the highest level of government in the United States, was evidence that the issue of slavery was going to eventually lead to even worse violence.
Territorial elections in the spring of 1855 ignite a storm of protests.
There are border ruffians who ride across from Missouri and vote in Kansas elections. And in the process, they often do a little looting and burning.
You had almost an exclusively pro-slavery territorial legislature that was elected fraudulently. So if you were President Franklin Pierce from New Hampshire, what would you do? Clearly, thousands of votes were fraudulent. There was no doubt about that. Well, he decided that he would accept the election of the fraudulent legislature rather than stir up any trouble.
But trouble is already brewing.
The Free Staters decided to hold their own election, and they established their own capital, which was at Lawrence, Kansas. So you had two governments, and you also had a number of men who were organizing themselves into a militia, and it was a very, very unstable situation.
You have some of the most brutal guerrilla fighting in American history. What this is largely night riding. It will produce the James Gang, the Younger Gang, Quantrell's Raiders, and will also be Jayhawkers in Kansas who will raid back into Missouri.
A man named John Brown goes into the homes of some prominent pro-slavery people, takes them out and summarily executes them, apologizing, but saying that, gee, you're pro-slavery and we can't have that. And this is an absolute.
You can only fight on this level, exercise this kind of cruelty where it's really personal. I mean, these are people who sometimes had been neighbors, who know each other, hate each other, and know where to find each other. And it's the kind of thing which will devastate this kind of countryside. Atrocities on both sides. Both sides will raise the black flag. They take no prisoners.
Kansas becomes bleeding Kansas. So much so that the United States Army had to go there in an effort to try to keep the peace. This is a sectional crisis that is, in fact, deteriorating.
And this controversy came back to the halls of Congress, and that is when you had the debates over what to do in Kansas between Charles Sumner attacking the Southern senator from South Carolina and calling slavery a whore, and his attack by a representative from South Carolina, Preston Brooks. So if you just can imagine this kind of thing happening on an ordinary daily basis, it just really did seem like the country was falling apart.
So settlers in Kansas are fighting themselves. Kansas is fighting itself. And even members of Congress are physically attacking each other. At this point, something needed to happen. So the nation turned to the Supreme Court to hopefully settle the issue of slavery and restore peace. And that chance came in 1857 with the case of Dred Scott versus Sanford. But rather than restore peace, the Supreme Court decision further divided the North and the South. Now, some background to this case. Dred Scott had been a slave in Missouri, whose master had died. So, while Scott's master was alive, he had taken him to Illinois and into the Wisconsin Territory, where slavery was illegal, but eventually moved back to Missouri, a slave state, before his death. So, start out in Missouri, slave state. They move to Illinois and then to Wisconsin. Slavery is illegal, but they eventually go back to Missouri, slave state, and then the master dies. So Scott, with the help of anti-slavery lawyers, filed a lawsuit stating that since Scott had at one time lived in an area where slavery was outlawed, then he should be able to become a free man. So he was a slave, but since his master had taken him to Illinois and Wisconsin, and he had lived in these areas where slavery was outlawed, then he should be granted his freedom and allowed to become a free man. But the court's decision was not what Scott, his lawyers, or many anti-slavery and abolitionist Americans would have expected. The Supreme Court, under Supreme Court Justice Roger Taney, stated that since Scott was a slave and therefore property of his master, he was not actually a citizen and had no right filing the lawsuit in the first place. Furthermore, the court ruled that Congress didn't have the right to rule on slavery in the territories, so the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. Since Dred Scott was basing his case on the fact that he lived in a part of the Missouri Compromise, he was basing it on an unconstitutional law, and so it had no merit. But the Supreme Court didn't stop there. The court also ruled that laws restricting the rights of citizens living in these territories to own slaves, therefore to own property, were unconstitutional, and even went so far as to state that all African Americans, free or slave, were not allowed to become U.S. citizens. All of this from what was supposed to be a huge landmark victory for abolitionists. So, to kind of sum up the ruling, Part 1, Scott, as a slave, was property of his master and therefore not a citizen. Since Scott was not a citizen, he had no rights filing the lawsuit in the first place. Congress did not have the right to rule on slavery in the territories, therefore the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional, and laws restricting the rights of citizens to own slaves in the territories were also unconstitutional. The fifth and final part of the Dred Scott ruling, all African Americans, free or slave, could not become U.S. citizens. This decision was met with very differing levels of acceptance. For white Southerners, the decision meant that their fight for slavery in the territories was a huge victory. For African Americans, this was not a victory, but it was a huge step backwards in their fight for equality. And many responded very angrily to the decision and called on whites to help join their fight for freedom. White Northerners were shocked by the court's ruling. Many had hoped that slavery would just kind of die out on its own. Remember, gradual abolitionists. But now it was seen as it would not die out in the South, and it could now be very easily spread into the West. Even Northerners that disliked the abolitionist movement thought that the court's decision was wrong. And Frederick Douglass summed it up and said it best when he stated, quote, "This infamous decision maintains that slaves are property in the same sense that horses, sheep, and swine are property, and that people of African descent are not and cannot be citizens of the United States."
In 1857, slavery was front-page news once again. In one of the most infamous decisions by the United States Supreme Court, Dred Scott versus Sanford, abolitionists, those opposed to slavery, suffered a major setback.
The history of the case of Dred Scott is fascinating because most students of American history know the name Dred Scott, but little is known about the individual himself.
Dred is a personal slave of an Army physician by the name of Emerson. Emerson is assigned to various places in the United States. He's a doctor in the United States Army. Among those places that he's assigned, a place which ultimately is in the Louisiana Purchase territory, the territory of Minnesota, really becomes ultimately the state of Minnesota. So Emerson goes around to these places, and he takes his slave with him. He takes Dred with him.
Dred Scott eventually claims that he should be freed for that because he was on free soil.
Remember, Missouri Compromise of 1820 made this territory north of 3630 free, and freedom attaches.
The initial problem with this lawsuit is, does he have any kind of standing to sue? The court that takes the case, headed by Roger Taney as Chief Justice, has 5 slaveholders on the court. And historians are very divided whether to give Taney any mercy on his decision.
What did Taney say? Well, Taney said, basically, on the jurisdictional question, that was the key thing. Could this guy who's claiming his freedom, Dred Scott, he's an African, could he sue in the federal courts? And Taney said no. He ruled for the first time on the meaning of citizenship, federal citizenship, and he said, in the ugliest language, you read the opinion, it'll bring tears to your eyes. He says, you know, people of African descent can never be citizens of the United States, even though states, and 5 states had made them citizens. Forget it. They cannot be citizens of the United States capable of suing in the federal courts because they are chattel property.
The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court wrote the majority opinion. Over time, it became a stain on Taney's reputation.
Taney's always associated with it. Ironically, towards the end of his life, Taney swears in Abraham Lincoln, a very feeble 84-year-old Roger Taney swears him in. And at Lincoln's inauguration address, he rails on the court as Taney sits there listening to it. And in fact, when Taney passes away shortly thereafter, there's comments made in the press that Taney finally gave a gift to the nation. He left.
The impact the Dred Scott decision had on the nation was negative. It widened the gap between the pro-slavery forces in the South and the abolitionists in the North. In just a few short years, the North and South would be divided, and the nation would be thrown into a terrible civil war.
Which brings us to our assignment for today. There's no written assignment, but you are going to need to know this information for the upcoming chapter test. So when you go back and study, I want you to specifically focus on the Kansas-Nebraska Act, what it said, the outcomes of it. Remember, border ruffians and the fighting in Bleeding Kansas and why Kansas got the nickname Bleeding Kansas. And you're also going to need to know the specific outcomes of the Dred Scott case. It was 5 different parts. What was supposed to be a huge landmark victory for the abolitionist movement turned into just a complete debacle and a huge step backwards for African Americans in their fight for equality in the United States. All right? If you have any questions, you know where to find me. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you tomorrow.